Welcome Regent Manny Dietz as well.
Morning or afternoon, I guess.
Regent Woodmansee,
Here.
Regent Cologne,
Here.
Regent Manny Dietz,
Here.
Regent Peterson,
Here.
Regent Saffold.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Perfect. Thank you. With that, I would first like to thank everyone for being here today. This meeting, while unorthodox for the committee to hold, has great importance. The board has noted at several points the importance of mental health and mental health support for students throughout my time on the board. This does not just come in the form of counseling and testing centers, though. Mental health must be a focus in everything we do. And it must be considered in all decisions in order to best support our students, faculty, and staff. Throughout this committee in particular, we want to bring forward conversations surrounding mental health as it relates to student discipline, specifically with academic misconduct, as is the focus of this panel today. I know that the goals of today's meeting is to have a conversation and discussion about this topic. In addition to my fellow committee members, Regents Cologne, Manny Dietz, Peterson, and Saffold, I would like to welcome all other regents who have joined us for today's meeting. Please know that this is a time for you to talk and ask any questions you may have of our panelists or others joining as well. I'd like to start today's presentation inviting our 4 panelists to turn on their cameras, as I see all of you have done. Thank you. As I introduce each of our panelists, I'd like you to share a few words about the role and responsibilities at UW System Administration or your UW campuses as it relates to student discipline or mental health. I will also be providing brief bios of each, so I hope I don't cover everything that you were going to talk about. To begin, we'll start with John Octor, the Student Behavioral Health Coordinator for UW System Administration. I do also want to send a quick shout out to John for helping to plan this event as well. He has been just a really pivotal part in this meeting coming to fruition. John Octor joined the Office of Student Success in August of 2020 and as the University of Wisconsin System's first Student Behavioral Health Coordinator. John supports students' behavioral health initiatives and accessibility services, working with counseling, health, and disability service professionals at all of the UW System campuses. He is a licensed psychologist with over 20 years of experience in higher education as a behavioral health practitioner, counseling center director, and student affairs administrator. He was a staff psychologist for 5 years in the counseling center at Concordia College Moorhead, before serving 13 years as the counseling center director at UW Stout. Just prior to joining UW System, he served for 5 years as Associate Dean of Students at UW Stout, where he chaired the Behavioral Health Intervention Team and was a Title IX investigator, and had supervisory oversight of the counseling, health, and TRIO programs. John is passionate about serving students from all backgrounds and draws on positive psychology and trauma-informed approaches in his work. John has earned both an MS and PhD degrees in counseling psychology from Iowa State University and a BA in psychology and philosophy from Concordia College Moorhead in Minnesota. His leisure interests include spending time with family, traveling, and many forms of exercise, especially outdoors. Thank you so much for being with us today, John. Would you like to give another brief overview?
Thank you, Olivia. That is more than enough, but thank you, everyone. I'm glad to be with you today.
Perfect. Next, we have Buzz Bears, Associate Dean of Students at UW Oshkosh. Buzz graduated with a bachelor's degree in biology from UW River Falls and a master's degree in counselor education from UW Platteville. Buzz oversees student conduct for both on and off campus and works closely with student behavioral health issues. Buzz's areas of focus in the Dean of Students office include non-academic and academic misconduct, the university-wide care team, withdrawals, and assisting with student needs and concerns. Buzz has worked at UW Oshkosh for 25 years, primarily in the residence life department. Buzz enjoys riding and showing horses and volunteering with 4-H and the high school equestrian team. In her spare time, she enjoys traveling and spending time with her husband, Toby, their 3 children, Ellie, Katie, and Ricky, and their granddaughter, Sophie. Welcome, Buzz. Would you like to say anything? Buzz, I believe you're muted.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Olivia. That covered most everything, although I have now a second grandchild as of about 2 weeks, so I'll have to update my bio. So, but thank you.
Thank you so much for being here and congratulations.
Thanks for that too.
Next, we have Debbie Reuter, Interim Director for the Center of Students with Disabilities at UW-Whitewater. Debbie is the Interim Director for the Center for Students with Disabilities at the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater. She completed her MS in School and Community Counseling at National Louis University. Debbie is a licensed clinical and professional counselor in Illinois and Wisconsin. Debbie has helped students with disabilities maneuver their transition to college and accommodations for 9 years at Harper Community College prior to coming to UW-Whitewater as the Associate Director of Disability Services. She is a member of the CARE team at Whitewater and presented as the Regional NASPA with Conduct Officer from Harper College. Welcome, Debbie. Would you like to add anything?
I don't think so. Thanks for having me. I'm just very happy to be here at Whitewater and fortunate to be able to have stepped into the interim role serving in this position. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here. Finally, we have Kristen Vespia, Associate Professor of Psychology and Director of Psychology at the Student Success Center at UW Green Bay. Dr. Vespia has published journal articles and a book chapter on topics such as career development, clinical supervision and counselor development, and mental health services on college campuses. She's particularly interested in multicultural and gender issues, particularly as these relate to vocational development, education, and mental health. She's also the director of the UW-GB Teaching Scholars Program within the Center for Advancement of Teaching and Learning. Welcome, Kristen.
Thank you very much. I appreciate you inviting us to be here today. And the only thing I would add is that in addition to being a faculty member, I had the pleasure of chairing the academic and non-academic misconduct committees on our campus for about 6 years. So I have a little bit of that background as well. So thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being here. Now, John, I believe we'll get started with a few questions unless the panelists had anything that they had pre-prepared before we move on with that. Does that work?
Yeah, we can jump into questions, but we did prepare about 5 minutes of kind of introduction from each of our perspectives. And Anne has a PowerPoint, if it would be okay to start with that.
Yes, let's begin with that. That sounds lovely.
Right.
Thank you again, everyone.
All right. So I'll kick this off. I appreciate the opportunity again to be with you all today. We put together this panel based on some initial conversations with Regent Woodmansee. We'll each share a little bit of information and then leave the bulk of our time for dialogue. My primary role will be to share a little bit of the types of mental health concerns and stressors that students reported, especially during the past year in the midst of COVID. And then I'm going to share a brief snapshot of how COVID impacted the number of cases related to academic misconduct compared to previous years. So next slide, please, Anne. So what do we know about mental health during COVID? If you followed news reports, you've likely heard that mental health concerns have increased for adults in general, and that the greatest impact has been on adolescents and young adults, so our prime population. Some are even calling this the pandemic after the pandemic, and there's some reason to agree with that. So 2 reputable organizations have done comparisons of college student mental health data between the fall of 19 and fall of 2020. And the bullets on your page here are what summarize that. So first of all, it is true amongst college students that mental health concerns increased in the last year. A couple of data points: approximately 50% of students screened positive for depression and anxiety in the fall of 20 on a national survey that does annual assessments of student mental health. Previous findings were consistently around 40% on the screening instruments that they used. So there was a 10 percentage point increase in that. One way to think about this for me is that when overall distress levels rise in a population, it exacerbates symptoms for those who were already struggling with their mental health, and it shifts the bell curve so that more people now meet criteria for mental health diagnosis. Another thing that we saw that might be surprising to some of you is that help seeking actually decreased. More students reported mental health concerns, but fewer sought help through our counseling centers for a variety of reasons. So we have this situation in which overall distress increased, but utilization of the supports for that distress decreased, meaning that more student distress went unaddressed. And some of the presenting concerns changed. So while depression and anxiety are always the most common concerns, and they were again, if you dig a little bit deeper into the types of issues students reported to our counseling centers, you do see some differences. So the 3 items listed there, academic stress, focus and motivation, loneliness and isolation, all increased in fall of 20 compared to students who were seeking help in fall of 19. Some of that to me makes sense, right, with the pandemic. And not all subgroups were impacted exactly the same way. So you could break this down in a number of different ways. I'm going to point to just one today for the purposes of our conversation. So academic distress increased amongst all students, and it was about 60% of students who sought counseling in the fall of 20 reported high academic distress. Overall, what's interesting is that this percentage was about the same across most of the subgroups when looked at in smaller segments. But one key exception was for students who identified with having 1 or more disabilities. And for some of our students, mental health does rise to a level of disability that can be accommodated in the classroom or other places on campus. So students who identify with disabilities, actually, there were 2/3 of those students reported high academic stress. So my colleagues are going to give some color around the student experience in the last year. You're going to hear from both a faculty member and from a disability services professional. Let's go to the next slide. So today's conversation is around the intersection of mental health and the conduct system, and specifically academic misconduct. So what you see here is that overall academic misconduct incidents rose on about half of our campuses during the present academic year compared to 1920. That resulted in an overall increase for system to just over 1,000 cases from just over 800 last year. And remember that we're not done with the academic year yet on our campuses, and a lot of our academic misconduct cases do come toward the end of a semester, so these numbers will actually rise. So going back to the fact that stress levels rose and student use of supports decreased, for me, it's not too much of a stretch to surmise that the rise of student stress contributed, at least in some way, to the rise of academic misconduct, since any of us are more likely to turn to unhealthy ways to cope when we're feeling stressed or overwhelmed. Of course, I'm not suggesting here that cheating is ever justified. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork to say that this may give a little bit of context to why we saw a rise this year. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Buzz Bears from UW Oshkosh to share information from the perspective of a conduct officer.
Thank you, John. And I want to thank all of you for your interest in this topic. I'm going to give a brief, very brief overview of academic misconduct process. And UWS Chapter 14 is the Academic Code of Conduct. And the process does mirror Chapter 17, which is the non-academic process. But there is a significant difference between the two, and that is that faculty members serve as the primary investigator in academic misconduct. And this is a very different role for most faculty, and one that most faculty are not particularly familiar with. So the instructor would determine if the student did violate policy based on a preponderance of evidence standard. If the instructor determines that they are responsible, then they would also determine what sanction would be most appropriate. The instructor does send a letter to the student outlining all the appropriate information, and then they will copy the Dean of Students Office on that letter. If it's a second case of academic misconduct for the same student, the Dean of Students Office does then initiate an investigation, but this does not happen very often that we get a second case for the same student. A student can appeal to the chancellor if the recommended sanction is suspension or expulsion, and a student does have a discretionary appeal to the Board of Regents for any sanction. And I find this last piece a bit peculiar, that a student can only appeal to the chancellor if the sanction is suspension or expulsion. But as you all know well, a student is allowed a discretionary appeal to the Board of Regents for any sanction. So even though the academic and non-academic processes are similar, In reality, the differences between them vary quite a bit, and I'll give you an example. It would not be uncommon for a student to talk about going out to a house party to drink with their friends, even if they're underage. It isn't uncommon for students to talk to their friends about being caught for underage drinking. But if you swap out cheating for underage drinking, those conversations aren't happening. Students do not talk about those kinds of things. It's not as normalized as the non-academic misconduct. And for those of us who are parents, if your student came to you and said that they got caught for underage drinking, while we may be disappointed and may ask them not to do such a thing again, I believe that that conversation would likely be very different if your student came and said that they were caught for cheating on a test. Cheating is really thought of very differently than most non-academic misconduct, and this can oftentimes put more pressure on a student, cause more stress, or perhaps more anxiety. Next slide, please. Just want to share a few resources and ideas that might help students who become involved in this process. Faculty will often reach out to the Dean of Students office with unusual cases, and these often involve mental health concerns. And by engaging with faculty before the process begins, it really does allow us to discuss how we can best help the student before, during, and after this process. So encouraging faculty to reach out is typically quite helpful. All campuses have some version of a student care team, and this team has the offices at the table that are really best suited to give the student the wraparound care and support that may be needed at any time, but specifically in this case, when academic misconduct or academic concerns come up. Unless a student were to self-identify with a disability, we typically wouldn't know. That is not a question that we would ask during any types of conduct meetings. But by including disability and accommodation information in all of our conduct letters, we can encourage students to use all of their available resources. So perhaps having that available and put in letters might be helpful for a student who chooses not to identify or self-identify and disclose that to us. While the Code of Conduct does speak to having an advocate during a hearing, it really doesn't talk about an advocate at any other time in the process. Now, typically we would allow a student to have an advocate at a meeting if they ask, but that's really only if they ask. So perhaps having a group of trained staff and faculty who would be available for students throughout the whole process might make it a more educational process and be less anxiety producing for students. During the pandemic, many schools had to do many things to try to help accommodate students. One idea was to allow students to drop a class on their own until the end of the semester. And this idea wasn't to have students be able to avoid the consequences of academic misconduct, but it may help keep them from thinking that this might be my only out, would be to cheat or to plagiarize. So by allowing them to perhaps drop it up until the end of the semester, it may keep them from thinking they should engage in this process. Thank you. And I would now like to turn this over to Chris Vespia from Green Bay.
Thank you, Buzz. And it's my role this afternoon to share a little bit of faculty perspective on these issues. Like the rest of my colleagues, I want to thank you for inviting us to be here today. I also want to just start out by acknowledging that, COVID has dramatically changed the academic process for our students over the last several semesters. It's changed it for our faculty as well. And there's just no doubt that there has been a steep learning curve for our students, if nothing else, just in terms of the technology that they're having to interface with as they get their education. And there's no doubt that that has added a layer of stress on top of that already imposed by the pandemic. I will be brutally honest in saying, as a faculty member, I absolutely see those increased stress levels, and as well as that increased risk of mental health concerns, as John alluded to in national trends. bucking UW system trends a bit, I haven't seen that then bear out in terms of increased rates of student misconduct, at least not academic misconduct. Where I've seen it instead academically is in more requests for extensions for makeup exams, more missed work, late work, some students who will have extended absences, and I'll have to work to try to re-engage them in the course. I'm also giving more incompletes as final grades at this point for students who aren't able to finish the work within the traditional confines of the semester. So that's how I'm seeing that stress play out academically in my own courses. I also, though, think it's important to recognize that how those stresses play out and the strategies that are being used to address those are probably somewhat unique to our individual campuses. So to use the campus I'm most familiar with, Green Bay, we have a large percentage of first-generation college students at our campus. Many of them are working 40 and more than 40 hours a week in addition to being full-time students and in some cases parents as well. They have been frontline essential workers, many of them, since the beginning of the pandemic, doing everything from childcare to being CNAs in long-term care facilities. You know, these are students who experience high stress under the best of circumstances. So then put them in the midst of a pandemic, you know, as a campus, we felt it was incumbent upon us to be as proactive as possible, both in terms of mental health needs and in academic needs. I'll speak simply to a few examples of academic actions that we took to try to stay ahead of issues. One of those was that in the spring of 2020, our Faculty Senate passed a resolution in support of equitable and accommodating grading for our students. In addition to that, as a campus, we made the decision not to invest in any online test monitoring software of any kind, so we simply haven't used that on our campus. We also, so I happened to be the interim director of our Teaching and Learning Center in spring 2020. So one of the things we worked on as a Teaching and Learning Center was providing additional guidance to faculty about making decisions around final exams and if they were necessary for classes. And if they were indeed necessary, then what were some best practices to reduce stress around that process for students. So those are just a few examples. Next slide, please. And then the other thing I simply wanted to do was give you a sense of the faculty role in the misconduct process. Buzz has already highlighted a lot of that. Couple of additional pieces I would add. I think there is a prevention piece that faculty have a role in making sure that misconduct policies are in our syllabi and making sure that we're taking responsibility for helping students to learn what is plagiarism and what isn't. Also for crafting assignments and exams that are just harder to cheat on and reduces the risks in that area. As Buzz already mentioned, we do become the investigating officers and the people who do the documentation. We also then are the folks who have the direct conversation with students about what has happened. The slight twist I would provide on what happens on Oshkosh's campus is that I would say on our campus, probably the majority of academic misconduct is handled solely between a faculty member and a student. So if you look at chapter 14, as long as a faculty member is staying within the sanctions A through C in that document, there doesn't have to be involvement of the Dean of Students office or a conduct officer. Those things involve an oral or written reprimand delivered solely to the student, or having the student redo the assignment to be regraded on its merits. And many faculty, frankly, don't wish to go beyond that. And so some of the statistics that you're going to see aren't necessarily going to reflect all of the misconduct that happens on a campus. I also just want to reinforce that this is an awful, awful conversation for faculty members and for students to have. These are not conversations we enjoy or wish to have, but we hope that whatever route the process takes, that it is an educational process. So personally, I also see a role for us as faculty in a sort of postvention with students, that hopefully one of the things they take away from this is that they are going to make mistakes in life. They're going to have to take responsibility for those, and there are going to be consequences for those. But it doesn't mean that there isn't a possibility of repairing relationships, rebuilding trust, and moving on from those mistakes. And I hope that's one of the lessons students can take from the process. So I will turn things over to Debbie, who works with disability services at UW-Whitewater.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Regents, for again having this topic, which is also near and dear to my heart as a counselor working in a disability center. And I'm glad to be able to represent the disability service professionals in Wisconsin. We have been really, just to give you some context of all of the additional work we're doing right now, you know, we're continuing to coordinate accommodations in the academic setting and for meetings and events like we always have, but with the new technology and all the new modalities of courses, we're doing our very best to make sure we're supporting students under these unusual circumstances, and also help train faculty in a lot of the different scenarios that maybe they're not so familiar with, like some of the captioning that's had to happen, or the remote testing accommodations. So we always take an interactive approach with students and try very hard to collaborate with faculty all the time in our office. So the nature of our work really is to be proactive. We make every attempt to reach out to students up front as they're transitioning from high school, to make sure they know about the services and resources available to them and their legal rights for accommodations. And you know, we hope that by intervening early, that also helps divert any kind of misconduct, because we have a relationship with the students, that they frequently come to the disability service coordinators to get support and guidance. You know, and some of the accommodations that are specifically related to mental health are things like flexibility in attendance and due dates. So if a student has a mental health condition that might be exacerbated during the semester, or any kind of health condition, but in this case, in a mental health condition, we like to prepare for that possibility up front. So by doing so, we would work with the student and help send out the accommodation for the potential of having a flexibility of attendance and due dates. Not that that's what anybody wants to happen, but just in case it does, we feel like it's important to do that outreach initially. And then oftentimes we'll sit down and meet with faculty and students together and kind of iron out how that might look, how they will work out getting the materials made up, when they'll get things turned in, what is a reasonable accommodation under that circumstances in that class. So those are kind of the collaborations we always are doing. We are also, you know, grappling with the complexity of this environment. So having to work through remote technology, like I mentioned before, it's not just with students, it's with faculty. So we've had to adapt to this for faculty who don't, you know, normally have to worry about captioning or interpreting in a classroom, and they have to pin somebody. So we've worked closely with our technology support people, with faculty, and with students to make sure they're getting the kinds of accommodations that they need. Some of the primary issues that sort of have arisen during this time have been, again, the things like captioning remotely, but also monitoring the testing environment. So a lot of faculty have chosen to use electronic monitoring software when students are testing remotely. For our students, that technology interferes with the screen readers. So for a student who uses screen readers to read material out loud to them, if they have a learning disability or for any other disability related reason, software shuts that down. So then we have had to come up with alternative formats of giving remote tests. So that might be that we have to hire aides to monitor the exams over WebEx, or if a student's remote, we don't want to require them to come to campus to test here. But typically, we're fortunate at Whitewater that we have a testing center that we do all the proctoring of the extended time and exams here. So normally, I think our testing environment is extremely secure, and students are not inclined to cheat in our center because they're putting all of their things away and they know they're being monitored. But it also has increased a lot of the stress and anxiety around testing for students, having it online and knowing they're being filmed. So we often have to talk through that with students. Again, because we have such an interactive and collaborative approach with our students, and try to meet regularly and intervene early with them, they often do have a good relationship with their coordinator and will reach out when something's happening. So next slide, please. Okay, so supporting students throughout this conduct process, how we might get involved, I would tell you that students with disabilities are held to the same standards of conduct as any other student. They don't get a free pass because they're a student with a disability. However, having said that, I do want to recognize that behavior is communicating something. So potentially it's communicating something related to their mental health or a communication disorder like autism. So we have ongoing relationships with the student and the faculty. When that happens, we hopefully can intervene early. As Chris suggested, a lot of these cases, hopefully they don't go to an extended level, and we can have a teachable moment with them and even assist in the communication with faculty and understanding some of the behaviors and what they're communicating. This is also an important reason why we are also members of the care team and collaborate through our care team and our conduct persons in that office, so that we can communicate when we have some concern about a student. The potential for a student to need an accommodation during the investigative process or a hearing is there. Sometimes if a student has an information processing disorder, communication disorder, or even some lack of insight related to their mental health condition, might be a reason for them to have an accommodation during the appeal process, whether that's as an advocate or additional written communication, some other additional way to help them understand what's actually happening, because of course they're going to be very stressed out and not really processing the information always the way they normally would. And finally, that students are expected to self-identify their needs for an accommodation, but students can identify that need at any time in their academic career. Sometimes students come to us and they had a bad experience in high school, or they just don't want to identify as a student with a disability. And the majority of the disabilities that students come to us with are invisible, so they may not choose to initially come to us. At Whitewater, we do have a reputation for having really extensive services, so we do serve a lot of students, but they could come later with the diagnosis or realize that they do indeed want to use an accommodation at some later point. So I think that having clear and written communication about a referral process is a good idea. And we always keep the door open with our Dean of Students office for communication. So that's all I have. I'm going to send it back to John, and then if we go on for questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Yeah, so that's the extent of our presentation. Hopefully that gave you a little foundation for your questions, but let's open it up for the rest of our time to questions from the committee or others.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. That was a very helpful presentation and a great intro into what I hope will be a very robust discussion. So as many of you can guess, I have some questions, but I would first like to open it up to see if anyone does. I see Regent Walsh. Do you have a question, I believe?
I do have a question for any of the presenters. So how do HIPAA rules complicate life for you if you're dealing with a student, let's say, that has a clinical diagnosis of depression or bipolar disorder or something? How much can we tell a faculty member? How what sort of problems does that create and challenges?
So maybe I'll speak to it a little bit, and then maybe Debbie would want to say something from a disability services perspective. But there's a lot of confusion in higher ed around HIPAA application. So really most of our campuses are not HIPAA covered entities, but that doesn't mean we don't take privacy very seriously. So we're covered by FERPA, right? And health and counseling records within FERPA have an exception that those have a higher level of protection. So if a student is receiving services at a counseling or health center, those records are going to be held private and not shared with anybody within the university. If a student, though, presents to disability services, they will be required to share some documentation in order to prove eligibility. What is then communicated from disability services to faculty, I think that's something Debbie can speak to better, how that communication process happens.
Yeah, so there's really no need for anyone to know what the specific disability is. So we consider FERPA the privacy rights of the student very seriously. We typically don't really talk to anyone without a signed release. There are students who are happy to sign a release. They like to have the extra communication with their faculty member. Maybe it is a student on the autism spectrum and they're okay with that open communication. Obviously, if it's not an invisible disability, oftentimes people know, but otherwise we do not release any information to faculty at all, and really to anyone, and disclose any personal private information about a student's disability. In some situations, maybe on the care team, when there is a need to know and we can help facilitate support for a student by communicating back and forth with one another, then it might be appropriate, but it's not going to be, widely discussed. It would just be maybe within the coordinator, myself, and whoever's handling the situation.
And then does the student know that this round robin discussion is taking place? Do they have to be informed before you do that?
I mean, we wouldn't be discussing it typically without a release. Under very rare circumstances, I think FERPA allows an as needed, a need to know basis. So we would take that and be very cautious about that. So,
Okay.
and yeah, I think that the student probably would still be included in the conversation. I feel like best practice is always just to include the student in the conversation at any time. So,
Yeah. All right. Thank you.
Perfect. Regent Clone and then Regent Manny Dietz.
Yes, thank you. I asked a few questions prior to the meeting. I think they were on the calendar invite. I think some of them were already addressed, but one additional one relating to the care teams and the wrap services that you have. Are there any mental health professionals that are included in that care team? So that's one question. And then the other question is where in the process, or is there anywhere in the process that we connect our students with outside resources like a disability rights or a legal aid society, so they have some support as they go through the process?
So I can take the first part of your question. The makeup of the care teams is pretty consistent across our campuses. And yes, they always include representatives from the counseling center. So you'll have at least one licensed mental health person. It's often the director. On some campuses, you might have two. So a lot of our campuses have case managers within their counseling centers who try to help coordinate all the many kind of links around campus or even off-campus resources. So one or two. You also have health professionals, and sometimes that is the director. Sometimes it might be a physician who would also have some training in mental health. Then you have disability services folks on those committees. Housing is usually on the committees, and they're often chaired by dean of students offices. Another important element would be law enforcement, because those teams are often looking at threats as well. So that's the typical makeup of our care teams.
How about the access to outside resources like a legal aid or a disability rights?
I guess I would say, sometimes whoever the case manager is would have experience and exposure to all those kinds of resources that they would provide. So I guess if it were needed, I think that on our campus at least, we would provide as much information that would be supportive or helpful to the student.
It seems like that might be a vehicle where maybe we're proactive in providing information to students just so that they, if they need some additional support outside of what the UW system provides, then that's something that could be proactively provided to them.
I definitely agree. Thank you for your thoughts. Do you have any other questions, Regent Cologne?
No, thank you.
Regent Bogos, do you have a question or do you have a comment in relation to Regent Cologne's points?
I do have questions, but I know it's not my turn, but I just wanted to interject something with Regent Cologne, what he said. And just from my vantage point, from being a legal advocate in several issues with student discipline, outside resources are so slim, it's really hard. And so I think that it's a great idea, absolutely. But I think that it's really disheartening because when they start to call around and find out that there are none to represent them, like, legal aid, legal action, community justice here in Madison, disability rights. So many times people get turned away, especially students, and they don't even know the resources available. So that's a really good thing, but they're slim to none. And it makes it really hard for the system, to send them out there. I always feel bad. I'm like, you can try, but, even to get past intake is really hard. So it's really endemic of a system that really needs an infusion of help. So I just wanted to add that, but it's absolutely a great help if it worked the way it was supposed to. So, and I'll ask my questions later because I know it's not my turn. So.
Perfect, thank you. Regent Manny Dietz.
Yes, thank you, Regent Woodmansee. So here's my thought and my question. My thought is that when we receive these to review at the Regent level, it's the result of a significant number of proceedings, hearings, investigations, all of which are adversarial in nature. And it appears that, at least from my perspective in looking at these, somewhere along the line, the student raises an issue regarding a mental health issue. And then we don't have, sometimes we do, but we don't usually have a diagnosis. We don't have an expert opinion. We don't have anything to help us determine whether or not this issue is something that's a valid reason or defense or something that would help the student in the situation they find themselves in. And it's frustrating when you're trying to review that situation because all the cards are stacked against the student. It's much like when I send a first-year law student to small claims court to appear against someone who's representing themselves in a claim against their landlord. You may get a very good person that's able to present their case to the court commissioner, or you may get someone who is unable to do that, and the first-year lawyer has their way with them, and it's all fair game because that's the way the system's stacked. In this case, I think our concern, and I'm going to speak for myself in this, is that the students don't have access to enough information when they get into this situation. Certainly people do things that they shouldn't do. Certainly people cheat. Certainly people try to game the system. Certainly people are trying to find the easy way out. That's because we're human beings. And then sometimes they find themselves, as I heard in this presentation this afternoon, face to face with the instructor who is accusing them of the wrongful misconduct. And that's the arena that they're in, with no guidance, no help, against someone who has their future in their hands regarding whether or not they get disciplined and have something on their permanent record. Sometimes they're facing a seasoned investigator who puts them through the paces. Sometimes they have to go to a hearing or they have to present written summaries of the conduct that they're accused of and what their excuse is. My point in all of this is we're dealing with young people in most instances who aren't experienced in this arena. shouldn't we, would you agree that we should have more resources available to someone that has student misconduct charge that they can at least go to and talk to and maybe be referred to somebody? Amy says it's hard to get that put together, and I believe it, but my gosh, if I was 18 years old, which was a long, long time ago, I wouldn't have known what to do or how to do it or how to represent myself or what to say or what the issues were. And we find ourselves as Regents having 4 standards of review that we have to look at to determine whether or not this fact situation fits within those 4 standards. Most of the time they don't, because the people don't know how to present them to us. They're not represented. They don't have the assets. They don't have the wherewithal to do it. And I've seen that happen with faculty too. When you appear before us in our faculty discipline or faculty hearings to determine whether or not something was amiss with the faculty in their, let's say, quest to receive tenure. You may be brilliant at your subject matter, but you're awful lawyers on your own behalf. And so what I'm saying is, shouldn't we be providing some assistance to the students to help them determine if they should present a diagnosis of a mental health issue? Would you recommend that? And if you do, where would we have to go on your campuses to get this talked about and maybe put into practice? It's a long bunch of statements and observations, but I'm sorry about that, but I had to get that out there. So answer whichever part you can remember.
I can jump in. This is Buzz from UW Oshkosh, and I agree with you, Regent Manny Deeds, that most of our students have never been involved in anything like this. And it's frightening, whether it's academic or non-academic misconduct. But I think especially with academic, because they are standing there talking to their instructor who may hold their future in their hands at that time. And I also agree that resources outside of the university are slim. So by perhaps having volunteers on our campus who are trained not in legal matters, but in our process, Chapter 14, Chapter 17, and are willing to walk with the students through this process as an advocate may help. And that might be a source that can combine both the needs for the students and perhaps understanding that there aren't a lot of outdoor or outside resources for our students. This would take commitment, certainly, for training people and getting the volunteers and training them. But to see our students going through this on their own is difficult, especially when it does get into a hearing. But even just that initial meeting can be extremely frightening. So I would agree that some resources would be great. Now, a student, if they do have a registered disability, would need to let us know that. And then certainly we can get them in touch with the disability services. But that is not a question we would typically ask, just like we wouldn't ask any medical diagnosis. But a lot of our students who are very anxious and stressed through this process don't have a medically documented disability. They're just freaked out and anxious, and they're worried what's going to happen. My dad's going to kill me if he finds out. So I think having some help for the students through this, even without a documented disability, could be helpful.
I appreciate that. I think we really have to. I know it costs money, and I know faculty volunteers time that they're not compensated for to be on these hearing panels, and I know all of that is true. But we're in a situation where everything that we do impacts these students and how they feel about us for the rest of their lives. And right now we have people telling us that there are 800,000 students that dropped out of school or didn't continue after a short while that we want to ask to come back to school. And I'm thinking, man, if I had a bad experience in school, I wouldn't want to go anywhere near a UW campus because of the way I was treated. So I think if we start thinking about it in terms of not only that particular student and their problem, but in how we treat them and how they think about us after they go on, whether or not we were fairly treated, I think is really important and maybe worth the investment. But But I think it has to be a system-wide approach to it. So, thanks.
I'd be happy to jump in as well if you want, but I just wanted to add a couple of things to what Buzz said. I completely agree. And stepping out of my faculty hat for a moment and into chair of misconduct committee hat, at this point on our campus, at the time when I chaired the misconduct committees, I was it. And so if there was a hearing, I was the only faculty member trained and available to do that. At this point, we actually have a committee of faculty and staff members who rotate responsibilities. And so those folks are trained anyway to deal with this process. And it might be possible, I don't want to volunteer my colleagues' time, but it might be possible if you have 3 faculty members who are available for hearings, if only one of them is going to hear a case, the other 2 certainly would have some training that they could provide process consultation to a student. I also know in our own Dean of Students office, we have 2 judicial officers. And, you know, one of those judicial officers, if a case is going to a hearing, is going to essentially be the equivalent of the prosecutor in that case. But we have then had the other judicial officer available to the student to answer questions about the process and to provide some guidance about that. I know there's no way, I don't think, to make this process not feel adversarial to the student. And, you know, the reality is that to some extent it is. But it also really, when it works, it truly is intended to be an educational, not a punitive sort of process. Now, there's no doubt that there can be very serious consequences. But one thing that I would hope to highlight a little bit is that when the conversation happens with the faculty member, I know the student probably doesn't see this, but the worst that we can do with them as a student under Chapter 14 is make them redo an assignment and not take a penalty on it, not fail them on it, not give them a lower grade for it, but just make them redo it to be graded on its merits. We can't go a step beyond that without invoking the official process where it's actually in the hands of conduct officers. And so when they're in that conversation with us, it might feel like we hold their futures in our hands, but in reality, we don't. Now, it's easy for me to say that, and I giggle because I'm incredibly professional, but I giggle when students refer to me as being intimidating because I still find that sort of humorous. But I know as much as I could, you know, will away my PhD or, you know, whatever it may be, I do feel intimidating to students. And so whatever the reality is, of course it's scary. So, but just to offer those few thoughts.
Perfect. This is a great discussion, and I know that this is just the beginning of it. And the ideas that we have today will not just go away at the end of this. We will continue to push for them, and that was part of the reason of bringing everyone together. I know we're running short on time, but I do want to get to Regent Bogus. So Regent Bogus, feel free to ask your question or questions at this time.
And I will make this really quick because I know and you had a bunch of questions, Olivia, but I really appreciate all your time. And I just want to jump in because what Regent Manydeeds brought up, and I know Buzz shared some of this as well, is that I really think that what is the most helpful sometimes is just having an advocate, whoever that person is. And I had addressed this with Title IX issues. They are so terrified, and whether they have a disability or not, and sharing that is really a big deal for them. Just having someone just in the initial beginning stage to address questions can take a lot of that stress off of these students. And I've been there with them before, and they don't want maybe they don't want any other help, but just having someone explain to them what's going to happen next, what the consequences are, because their imaginations go insane, and some of them end up not doing well at all. Some of them drop out, some of them, go home, and I've seen horrible situations where they just don't want to face anything. And then it's just as far as disabilities, I think we put a lot of the onus on the students, of course, to advocate for themselves. But, and I guess this is a question for later, but I've always I've dealt with students who say, I've told my professor, I didn't want to go any further about opening up to them because but they don't believe me. And I don't know how much that is the issue, but they feel like they really have to open up about their disability and what they've gone through because the professor looks at them like, yeah, sure, and maybe that's just on them. But I just wonder if there's a way to train faculty a little bit better and just, I know that they're told that they have to just take whatever the student says. But I think it's just a difficult situation. So I'll stop there. Sorry.
Did you have any questions you wanted answered, Regent Bogus?
Well, I don't think we have time, but I just wanted to know about, if they find that the situation with faculty and students when they come to them with issues, and, it's up to them to advocate, and their faculty is not supposed to know, what their diagnosis is, but a lot of them share it anyways because the students tell me they feel like they're not going to get anywhere unless they say, this is what I have, and this is why I didn't get my paper in, and or I was in the hospital, which they don't want to share, but they feel that, the faculty, and I'm sure the poor faculty has seen the other way where students, make up all sorts of things about why they did what they did. So it's a difficult situation. I don't know if the faculty and staff has any issues or seen any way to deal with this, but I know we're also running out of time. So I don't want to take up too much time. I'll end it there.
I think that's a great note to end on, is just, we need more training, we need more support, and we shouldn't be putting students in these positions. And I think at the end of the day, that is part of the reason why we wanted to have this discussion. So I first and foremost want to thank everyone once again for being here, being part of this. I want to thank our panelists, especially for the time you've given to this presentation, the work that you do on your campuses. John, for all of the work that you do for our entire system. I'm so excited to have you here in your position. I also want to thank Chris Navia for taking this on. It's one of her, I think, 100 jobs that she currently has within our system. And Ann Minson, who is just a phenomenal person. So what an asset to have to our system, and what an advocate for students throughout everything she does. With that, if any regents have questions that they didn't get answered or would like to follow up on any conversations they heard, please email Jess and she will reach out to our panelists, and I'm sure they'd be more than happy to continue this conversation. This meeting is not where this conversation ends, and that is what I really want to emphasize to everyone. With that, I will seek a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
In a second?
Second.
Perfect. Thank you once again, everyone, and happy Tuesday.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.